File classifications is a great way you can associate metadata with any of your data files in NVivo. This metadata can allow me to record attributes associated with each data file. How useful these are depends on your research. Generally, this is an essential component for anyone who's undertaking documentary analysis or any form of literature review with the use of NVivo. File classifications would allow us to organise and sort our files by important data such as year of publication, authorship, and source type. In this example, I'm going to create an interview file classification, apply that to some files, and then add some attributes or metadata about this. To start off with, I need to start in the file classification folder. NVivo makes no assumptions about the kind of data you are going to use within the program. As such, no pre-existing file classifications exist, although there is a quick list that you can add in. To create a new file classification, I right-click here and choose New Classification. Here I can give it a name and create a classification, or to save some time, I can bring in one of these pre-existing classifications. In this case, I'm going to ignore this option and choose Create a New Classification to do this manually. I'm going to call this Interview. It's really important to understand that file classifications usually apply over a wide range of files. So at this point, I'm not referring to a particular interview, but the broader category of file, which in this case is interview. I can later add attributes about each individual interview to this. But to start off with, I'm going to click OK and just leave this file classification as is. I can now tell NVivo which of my files are interviews, and to do so, I find a file, I right click on it, and in the context menu choose classification, and then in this case interview. I can of course save myself time and use the Shift key to highlight multiple files and repeat this process. NVivo now knows all of these files are interviews. However, I can associate a lot more richer data about each of these files using my file classification. To start off with, I need to return to the file classification by clicking on the folder and right-clicking and choosing New Attribute. Here I can begin to set up the kinds of data I want to associate with my interviews. For example, it might be useful for me to record who the interviewer was. To do so, I'm just going to create the new attribute of interviewer. At this point, I could just click OK, in which case I would have to manually type in who the interviewer was for each of the files that are classified as interviews. However, in the case of this project, there are a limited number of possible values, so I can use the Values tab here to specify them. To do this, I click Add and type the name of each value. In this case, there's Henry, there's Linda, Nancy, and so on. I can then click OK. Now that I've done this, I can return to my interviews and actually apply this data to each of them in turn. There are several ways I can do this. To do it one by one, I can choose one of my interviews and right click, go to Document Properties, Attribute Values, and from the drop down menu, select who the interviewer was, in this case Henry. Alternatively, on the Home ribbon, I can choose File Classification, select the file classification, in this case interview, and en masse I can add all of the data in. So for example, Charles was interviewed by Linda, and Dorothy, Henry. It's also worth noting there's a whole range of different styles of attribute that I can apply. If I return to file classifications and to new attributes, you'll see I can record text, integer, decimal, date, time, date and time, and Boolean attributes. For each of these, I can choose to specify values or leave this blank. In the case of leaving it blank, when I return to add that data, I would have to type it in turn for each particular file. While this process might not be the most useful for interviews, it is really important if you are doing any form of documentary analysis, in which case things like year of publication and authorship are really important for your analysis. It's useful to always think carefully about whether or not file classifications are useful for you, but any attributes that you put into NVivo you can later use when you are refining your data, analysing it and querying it. If you find that you don't need these to start off with, you can always go back and add them in later. To show this feature in practice, I've switched to a different project. This is based entirely on the literature, and file classifications are really important. I'm once again going to open the file classification sheet, and this time you'll notice I've named this one reference because each of my files are a reference. Here you'll see there is a whole range of very detailed information stored about many of the files in this project. You can see stuff such as what type of reference it is, whether it's a journal article or a report, the author, the year of publication and the title. In this project, it's comparing 1995 to 2005 to 2015. In this case, file classifications are absolutely essential, and each of these are associated with each of these PDF files of the journal. Here you can see all the attributes are stored, and because of this, I can later return and search on them. Of course, if my project was just a handful of interviews, this may not be a useful feature.